Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Your Legislators. I'm your host, Jonny Coker. Joining me to talk about the ongoing legislative work in New Mexico's capital is Representative for New Mexico's 33rd District, Micaela Lara Cadena. Representative, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello, thank you.
Of course. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is a bill you're sponsoring, HB 417. That would raise alcohol tax by 6%, as well as change how the money is distributed away from the general fund. Just give me an overview of why you're sponsoring that bill.
Certainly, I appreciate this question. I'm honored to serve as the Vice Chair of New Mexico's House Tax and Revenue Committee, and as such, I have a front seat to conversations about the tax policy we've laid out in New Mexico and how we raise our revenue. What I've learned in the last couple of years, thanks to incredible public health advocates and champions in this body, including Chair Ferrari, is that we hadn't updated how we taxed alcohol since the 90s. Those incredible advocates had brought various proposals forward to increase the rates on this historic tax. And as I started to look closer at this issue, I realized that the tax that has been in place and looks very similar in most of the states across the country was actually one of the most regressive taxes we had on the books. So as it stands today, we tax alcohol at the wholesale level. So when a distributor sells alcohol to a retailer who ultimately sells it to a consumer, there's a tax levied at that point. That tax is not based on the value of that product, the dollar the product sold for, but instead we tax by alcohol type and volume. So as such, whether the final product was a $3,000 bottle of wine or a $3 bottle of wine, the tax imposed was the same. Ultimately, that means that people of lower incomes or less means we're paying a bigger burden of that tax or a bigger share of that. So now we're at this point with a compromise bill in House Bill 417, because again, these advocates were compelling and I was convinced that we needed to modernize the tax, but I wanted to do so in a more equitable, fair way. So this proposal is twofold. First, it freezes the excise tax that's been in place since the 90s. So there's no adjustment for inflation. We're not trying to catch up to those rates 30 years later, but we're freezing them. One, because down that supply chain, it means that the wholesalers are still having a tax liability, but we're going to keep it in place, and that generates pretty consistently $50 million in revenue for and coming to the New Mexico budget. The change we're making there, historically, about half of that went to the general fund. It's not my belief that these kind of excises, taxes, or sometimes people call them sin taxes. I don't think we should be raising taxes like that to build our budget or to pay for New Mexico's government. Instead, I think we should point those dollars to mitigate harm that comes with these substances. So moving forward, should this bill pass, the full pile of that, about $50 million a year, will now be distributed to the counties based on a formula where we send the dollars where they're most needed. So looking at a weighted average of population and alcohol-related deaths, we'll send dollars to counties, people on the ground who know and care about these issues so deeply so that they can work addressing the harms that come from alcohol and substance use. Secondly, this bill does bring to life a new tax. What advocates in front of my committee and others had argued for years is that if we increase the price of alcohol, we change behavior, we decrease consumption. I know in our state, we've all been touched and by what it means to see and love and hold and care for and often lose people navigating dependency and substance misuse. So while those arguments still aren't quite convincing to me, like I know for the people I know struggling with alcohol dependency, that it doesn't matter how expensive we might make a product, they're gonna find a way to get what they need and to not get sick that night, to make it another day. All that being said, there are some populations where changes in price can change behavior, in particular for younger people and people that aren't yet in dependency stages of alcohol use. So I am proud that over all these years of collaboration, the second piece of the bill means we are introducing a new alcohol retail tax. In the bill, it's called an alcohol or liquor excise surtax, but it's at the point of sale. So if you or I, Jonny, were buying alcohol, whether that would be a drink that we'd consume on site or a alcohol that we'd pay for and take with us, there will be a new tax imposed. The proposal that we're going to bring to the House floor this week, I hope, and floor amendments will have a two-tiered tax rate. So for on-site consumption, if you're sitting down and someone is pouring you a drink and you're consuming that beverage before you leave, that tax rate will be 3%. For all other alcohol sales, whether it's a grocery, a gas station, an actual package store, the tax rate will be 6%. What we're doing with the receipts, the net receipts, the money that comes in from this new tax, I feel is probably the most profound part of this bill. So first of all, we, for the next 10 years, would set aside $3 million a year, send that to a Center for Alcohol and Substance Use Studies at UNM, so that we could actually have New Mexico data on what's happening in our families and communities, so that we could be studying potential programs and interventions. We'd also have a better sense of how New Mexicans respond to these changes in price and whether or not their lives are different because of it. After that, the rest of the money that we'd raise from this new tax, we, in this bill, would be sending it to the Indian Affairs Department. They would establish a council called the Tribal Alcohol Harms Alleviation Program, with representation of the 24 tribes, nations, and pueblos that exist within the settler state boundaries of New Mexico. And that council would make decisions about how to equitably distribute the money we raise. What's also very cool about this proposal is that beyond the representation from the 24 tribes, nations, and pueblos, we've also called for 4 seats so that representatives serving urban Indian populations could also be part of that conversation. So for years, we've heard the really hard data and reality that when it comes to alcohol use in a state like New Mexico, that harm is held closest and heaviest in Indigenous communities. So we're not projecting that we raise this money for the state budget or we put it to other purposes, but instead in a really valued way, sending that money where it's needed most, both to the counties where the harm is quantified, and then to tribal nations themselves and tribal people and communities themselves to decide how to care for this harm.
And Representative?
Thank you.
No, of course. What would be your response to folks that say that this is going to put undue burden on small businesses who are going to feel the brunt of that type of tax?
Certainly. I did not come to Santa Fe to raise taxes on anybody, and certainly I didn't ever have it in my head that I would be so deeply involved in a debate and effort to modernize New Mexico's alcohol taxes. Part of what I've fought for through this legislative process, including through the House Health Committee and the House Tax Committee, is to make sure that this is a fair tax policy. There have been efforts to carve some kind of small businesses out while we leave others in. For me, what I learned when I got here, and I certainly try to stick to that today, a tax policy is fair, and a tax is a good tax if you're taxing the value of a good, but also if you keep that base broad and lower those tax rates. So the amendments that we'll be hopefully bringing to the floor in the next few days mean that anywhere you go to buy tax in New Mexico, you would be seeing these new taxes. So for me, we are not singling out any business. We're not putting any kinds of businesses at a disadvantage, but it's a statewide effort to modernize how we tax alcohol in a fair and equitable way. And most importantly, I believe if I'm going to raise taxes, I have to have a justifiable need to raise that revenue. So again, this isn't to sit in New Mexico's general budget, but we'd be raising dollars and doing what we can to mitigate the harm associated with alcohol use.
And Representative, I did want to move on because there's a lot that I did want to get to. You are, you are sponsoring a bill. It's HB 427, real-time water quality monitoring. It would amend the Water Project Finance Act to incorporate real-time water quality monitoring into the state. Can you just give me an overview of that bill and why you're sponsoring it?
Yeah, of course. In the part of New Mexico that we call home, many of us turning on the local news or the news we get out of El Paso, we've all heard that, for example, KRWG has been in crisis. Our friends, neighbors, families that live on the borderlands, when they go turn that spigot on and expect to have water, as we all do for our basic necessities, there have been dangerous notices that have come out in regarding to arsenic in particular. So this bill relies on the trust of a New Mexico entity called the New Mexico Water Trust Board. It's been in place for decades, and they look statewide to prioritize projects and then provide financial assistance to local governments and water authorities in seeking to make sure they have a reliable water supply across different types of systems. So to date, there's 6 purposes that entities can seek funding and financial assistance for. We're adding a 7th, and that would be real-time water monitoring. So this wouldn't replace the important regulatory and compliance roles that agencies like the New Mexico Environment Department have in place, but instead give local authorities and governments real-time information so that we can be responsive, whether it's sending out a notice that water isn't safe to drink that day, or putting someone on a boil alert, or bringing some urgent fix to a system. This is a first step in making sure we know what's in our water. And for me, yeah, New Mexicans deserve that across the state.
And so what criteria would be used to decide, which entities or projects would receive grant funding for this type of quality monitoring? Because I know you mentioned, KRWG, especially in the southern part of our county, is, probably the most relevant to at least us in this part of the state. But practically, like how would that work in terms of choosing who gets what funding?
So my bill does not contemplate that, but the Water Trust Board has well-established priorities and their own set of rules that local governments and water authorities are familiar with should they bring a proposal forward. One of those that I know top of mind is that if a project happens to have federal match dollars, that can help it be prioritized in the Water Trust Board process. What we have done in conversations with the Municipal League and others is estimated about how many governments out there might be interested in a project like this, technologies like this. So we've used those numbers to estimate that maybe half of the municipalities out there would be in a place or in a water system that would look for technology like this, and then put those numbers in this bill so that making sure, even if that were possible, we wouldn't be draining the resources of the Water Trust Board, but again, just adding this to the list of projects that a government could spend on as related to their water system. I'm really always impressed by the Water Trust Board. They have, again, their own well-established process. When they put projects on a list, they then come to the legislature for approval. So every year, and I think just yesterday, we passed the Water Trust Board project list. So there's multiple steps and stages to make sure that there's accountability and statewide prioritization of these projects.
And Representative, to go off of that bill and that line of questioning, just talking about New Mexico's water resources, you are a member of the House Agriculture, Acequia, and Water Resources Committee, and a piece of legislation that's sitting in that committee right now is the Strategic Water Supply Act. Basically, the original legislation talked about treating produced water as well as brackish water be used in a way to preserve the state's freshwater resources, and the produced water aspect was recently taken out, but you had voted to advance the legislation with your committee's substitutions. So what do you feel like are the strongest points of this legislation, and why did you vote to advance that?
Certainly. So this is a bill being moved by the governor's office with some important legislators putting their political capital behind it. That bill did not get out of the House Ag and Water Committee on their first try, in part because myself, my neighbor, both my office mate and neighbor from down south, Representative Rubio, and others, had some pretty significant questions about what the purpose and implications of that effort were. One of the things I've raised consistently in this committee is that I've felt a little bit frustrated that we are combining water policy of pretty significant impact with economic development efforts. That was part of what was happening in this bill. They were establishing new types of water, also talking about how they needed to spur economic development and investment by promising water sources to new people interested in coming to build out in New Mexico. We held on to that committee or to that bill for a minute to make sure at least early on some of our concerns were beginning to be addressed in the committee sub that we eventually passed out. I voted yes in the end because in New Mexico and in this body in particular, I don't think we're having enough conversations about water with the urgency that this crisis merits. We somehow, in many circles, are still fighting about adjudication and legal rights to water, when as I see it, the reality we're facing is those rights have been rights on paper for a long time, and the future we're facing means that we have to have much more serious conversations about how together we're going to exist with the diminishing water supply. Because of that, I've said it pretty consistently, I want to make policy decisions that are grounded in science and New Mexico-driven science. My issue with that bill wasn't actually the potential of treated produced water, or certainly not the treated brackish water. It was more so that we're combining these policy conversations with economic development. But moving forward, I'm really proud that at New Mexico, we have established a produced water research consortium. We also have leading researchers studying the potential uses and beneficial uses of brackish water. So embedded in that bill and what's left of it as it comes to the House floor are millions and millions of dollars to study aquifer mapping across the state and to better understand the science, so that if there's a future in which we have to consider treated brackish water, produced water, as we are today, part of New Mexico's water ecosystem, we have science to back up those decisions. So I thought it was important to keep the conversation going. Our committee holds one base and body of expertise. It went on to the Energy Committee, where they had really important insight as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure that conversation around produced water will continue to come up in the state legislature as long as there are water issues in New Mexico. But in terms of other legislation that might help preserve New Mexico's freshwater resources, I mean, how as a state can we, especially in the midst of a drought and growing wildfire seasons, and we're having less snowpack on the mountains than ever before, what are some pieces of legislation or some other creative problem-solving methods do you see that the state could be taking advantage of in terms of preserving our freshwater resources?
I was surprised a couple of months ago to read some local journalists in New Mexico were reporting on the top water users in Albuquerque. So Albuquerque and the Bernalillo County exist in a water utility authority together. And their single top user of water was a golf course in this era, right? So yes, I am grateful that we're having conversations about less traditional water sources and how we repurpose, we reclaim, we treat water to safe standards for other beneficial uses. I've also had conversations in my office this session about all the water needs, for instance, of the renewable energy economy. And I had somebody in my office talking about, imagine if we probably could use treated produced water when we're pouring the concrete bases to the transmission lines that are serving the wind farms that are now going to stretch all up and down eastern New Mexico. Like it is our responsibility to have the policy framework, so all of these possibilities are in front of us. But we also, at a basic level, need to think about what we're using fresh water for and whether those uses are justified. So early in the session, with much less controversy, we passed the bill. And I think it stipulated that if state-owned property was going to go through some update moving forward, that instead of replacing grass, we would replace with xeriscape landscaping. It's all of these pieces should be in the conversation. How are we using the fresh water we have? How are we resolving litigation, including New Mexico's big case at the Supreme Court today, New Mexico versus Texas, that most directly impacts us water users in down south, to actually thinking about what other potential beneficial uses of these water types might be.
Mm. And Representative, I wanted to again move on. And speaking of use of water resources, a big use of there's a lot of water used in the oil and gas industry, and I wanted to ask about House Bill 548, which would enact the Oil and Gas Equalization Tax Act. It's in the committee that you're the vice chair of, the Tax and Revenue Committee.
Mm-hmm.
The bill proposes implementing a 0.85% tax on oil and gas products extracted and sold in the state. I just wanted to ask, where do you stand on this bill? And how do you anticipate voting on it?
Yeah, we actually just heard this bill for the first time in committee earlier this week. It's Monday. And I think we went to maybe 3 hours of debate on this bill. There are a lot of questions raised about equalization and how we tax industries fairly across the board. What's actually at play here is that historically, there used to be different taxes that were stacked both at the federal and state level that meant for a long time there were equitable taxes for gas that was extracted and often comes to the surface as part of the oil extraction process, and then the oil product itself. So the argument that Chair Small is bringing here is that we are leaving money on the table because at this point, the oil product is taxed at a lower tax rate for this particular tax mechanism than the natural gas is. We had a lively debate for now, as is our procedure in tax committee. We tabled that bill, and we will be having further conversations about whether it's the right kind of policy to include in the tax package should we be moving one forward. But yes, it would raise eventually about $400 million a year. And there was really important arguments that as we all learned about what this conversation entailed. It is important to note that these are different products in different industries, and we have different mechanisms for taxing them throughout this tax framework. So this is not the only place we collect taxes, nor the most significant. But yeah, there's an argument that we're leaving revenue on the table. I think one of the most important questions raised was whether it's justifiable to go after that money right now when we don't need it. One of the things that has come up again and again in tax committee and other places is that as the federal government is acting pretty erratically right now, that there may be a reality in coming months that New Mexico has to be quite responsive to some kind of budget or fiscal crisis based on the decisions of the executive and what the courts do related to those actions. So one of the things I've heard most directly that seems in front of us is that should the federal government do something that would be so disruptive to our budget and how we rely on federal dollars, likely we will be back in a special session pretty quickly.
Interesting. And that's an interesting way to put it, to be raising these funds for New Mexico just in case, with everything happening in the federal government. But so as a legislator, how do you balance the push for, when it comes to oil and gas being such a big driving factor for the state's budget, such a big moneymaker, how do you balance pushing diversifying for more energy sources with the state's dependence on oil and gas revenues, especially in a time like now?
Thank you. I love this, especially as our last question. I've just got a knock, so we've started third reading, so I will be heading to the floor now to take some votes. But to wrap with this, I'll say, it's really important for me as a New Mexican, as a mother, as someone who is raised here and doing what I can to raise my little ones here, that we have different conversations about how our values show up in these economic situations. As a New Mexican and a policymaker, I know and I'm proud that we've moved towards the Energy Transition Act. We've tried to make sure that the energy and power we use is renewable and isn't contributing to the carbon crisis that is happening here and everywhere else. At the same time, we have these resources, whether it be the Permian Basin that we share with Texas or the wind on the eastern side of our state, that are part of our economies that we export elsewhere. And so what's fascinating to me about these new projects, and especially the renewable ones, we have put all sorts of tax policies and incentives in place for this kind of development, but most of those projects are exporting what they produce to Arizona and California, where their energy prices are higher. So for me, as someone that cares about equity, it's time that we treat both of these industries fairly and with the same kind of conversations about the jobs they're creating, the economic development they spur, and where ultimately that energy is going. So all these projects we're seeing, whether it's oil and gas or wind on the east side, overwhelmingly we're exporting those resources, and that's okay, but we need to make sure that our tax policy reflects that as economic development, and then differently, that we as policymakers are also creating the means and framework so that what we use, the power we use in New Mexico, aligns with our values and our acknowledgement that human-caused climate change is real, and we are feeling it every day.
Well, Representative,
I gotta run, Jonny.
No, yeah,
I
know you have to run. I know you got a busy schedule, so I just wanted to thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate you taking the time, especially at this point in the session. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
And that's all for today's episode. We'll be back next week to continue our coverage of New Mexico's legislative session. If you have questions that you would like me to ask lawmakers, you can submit those questions to feedback@nmsu.edu. In the meantime, you can stay up to date on the latest local news at krwg.org. For all of us here at KRWG Public Media, I'm Jonny Coker, and we'll see you next week for another episode of Your Legislators.